we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. I thought I'd jump on here and let you guys know, since you're watching on YouTube, I did forget to hit fucking record on the camera again this week. I'm so sorry. This episode's going to be audio only. Enjoy. See you next week. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast for any reason, hit us up for a new topic, or if you ever want to even join us here on the podcast, please reach out to us on our Instagram at the Bigmark Podcast, or on our Twitter at the Bigmark Pod. So check us out there, and like I said, hit us up. Rate the podcast if you have time. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And if you have, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who follows along and joins and does all that great stuff and suggests topics, or even just follows along, follow whatever. You're there, and I appreciate it. Thank you. If you ever did want to support the podcast, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. And there's a couple tiers there, but I'm going to start to streamline things over there. But again, thank you to all our patrons. One of my favorite podcasts of all time, called The History Hyenas. They're history hyenas, so they're hyenas, so they're a matriarchy, and they used to call their Patreon instead of Patreons, they called them matrons, like matriarchs, like matriarch. Anyway, wild show, love it. Check out the History Hyenas. That doesn't exist anymore, but the comedians do. Giannis Pappas and Chris DiStefano. Check them out. Super funny. But I always want to call the people who support the Patreon the matriarchy. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Patreons. Thanks to everybody. And again, thank you for being here tonight. I'm excited about tonight's episode, as always. We're going to talk about Shane Gillis. Interesting guy. I mean, depending on where you're coming from, and if you've heard about him before, you might be coming into this podcast listening with an attentive ear. Let's just put it that way. You might be coming in hot. So I get it. It's not going to be anything wild. I hope anyway. I'm not trying to rock any boats, but I've had some interest in the guy lately. I don't know what it is. Sometimes it's funny. I guess this happens with a lot of comedians, and you get into certain guys and you appreciate their comedy. And in today's podcasting world, that's kind of like the way things go. You get to listen to a person's life, and honestly, sometimes, and I hope it's not everyone who's listening, but if you've gone and come back, welcome. But if not, hopefully you'll be back. But like I was about to say, sometimes you leave a podcast. Sometimes you just have to go on to something else just because you're like tired of what the person has to say. So hopefully I don't keep things too boring around here. But again, finding a new comedian that you're interested in is fun because you get to see all their new stuff. And Shane hosts a podcast as well. So there's a lot of content out there, and he has some some comedy specials out there and all types of things. So Shane Gillis, everybody. He's a 35-year-old comedian born in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, which is near Harrisburg, which I guess is near Pittsburgh. Fucking Berg City out there, boys. But fun state, Pennsylvania. Getting after it. Again, like I said, he has a podcast that he co-hosts with Matt McCusker, fellow comedian. Their podcast is called Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast. Interesting podcast that will come back again in today's story about Dr. Shane Gillis here. He's not a doctor, but it'll come back later on. So remember that. Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast. Really interesting. It's Matt and Shane, obviously, just sitting at a table talking shit. Kind of a la History Hyenas. Maybe that's why I appreciate it. Like, it's something really fun about when two hosts are both comedians, and there's like kind of that back and forth there, and they each have something to throw off each other, and It's pretty interesting format, and they just kind of riff. They're barely ever talking about anything. It always seems like they pick out the name of the podcast episode like from like the last 5 minutes of the episode. Hilarious. Check it out. Pretty funny. Shane Gillis himself, it's kind of funny. Shane jokes about this himself as well, but on paper, Shane Gillis is like fucking dope. Like he's sick. So he played high school football. He's an offensive tackle and he graduated in 06, but he went to West Point. And as soon as you're in West Point, like you are, or if you are like enrolled in West Point, like during a war, like an active war that America was in, and they were in Iraq, in Afghanistan, I guess at that point. But anyway, there was like an active war going on. So since Shane was at West Point, he technically was an enlisted soldier. So he's a soldier, West Point. And he was like technically played on the football team at West Point. So he played D1 football. And then he went on to become a cast member at SNL. So this is all on paper. But sadly, he quit West Point about a year in. He finished university at Westchester University. Played a little bit. He went to Elon University in North Carolina as well, and he played football at both places. I think at Westchester. He played football at Elon anyway, but ended up graduating and taught some English in Spain for a few months, which is fun. But then I guess he came back to the States and started comedy in 2012. It's interesting, there's this old adage that I've mentioned before, that I heard, which I thought was really funny, is that all stand-up comedians want to be musicians and all musicians want to be stand-up comics. And I always thought that was really funny. Because I love stand-up comedy. I appreciate it. The art is wonderful. I think it's really cool, but I feel like I could sometimes do it. And I was the MC at my buddy's wedding. Shout out Julian and Sarah. I was the MC at their wedding, and it's kind of like you're like doing like stand-up, but I didn't have any bits or anything. I guess I wrote some words before, but I wasn't trying to like be funny. My whole approach was just like, be concise, say a couple things, keep things moving, little chuckle, little heart, pull on the heartstrings a little bit, but like keep things going, keep things moving. That was my whole goal. So, but it was fun, and I didn't shit my pants. I feel like that's the big thing with musicians, why they feel like they can do it. Is like, oh, I've been up on stage, I know what I'm doing. But it's so different when you don't have any instruments. It's different when you're with a band. It's weirder when you're completely alone up there with a guitar. But if you're just up there solo dolo, nothing, the world is on you. All the lights are looking at you. So it's a different beast. And then, not every stand-up comic can play an instrument, but they love music or whatever. So anyway, the reason I bring that up is because, like I said, I've always appreciated comedy, and I feel like starting as a comic must be a little bit like starting starting as a musician. You're kind of just, you're kind of getting out there, you're playing open mics. I mean, open mics for comedy are obviously a little bit different than open mics for music, even though the open mics that I host, if you're in the Hamilton Dundas area every third Thursday at Sean and Ed's Brewery in Dundas, Ontario, I host the open mic there. And I do say, like, hey, anyone who wants to come up, bring an instrument. If not, I have a guitar. And even if you wanted to come up and do a tight five, come on up. So I always say, like, if there's any stand-ups in the crowd, you can come up and do it. It's an open mic, but rarely do the two ever meet. Like, truthfully, there's comedy open mics, and then there's music open mics. But anyway, they're both similar that way. And then, kind of how you raise up in the ranks. Sometimes you're opening for a bigger comedian, and, you travel around with them. Same thing in music. You're playing clubs, and then you start playing theaters, and you start playing bigger places, right? So there's a parallel there. That's all I'm saying. So anyway, Shane started in 2012. So I'm kind of assuming some of his trajectory, but he probably played places around Pennsylvania, around Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, I'm sure. And he ended up starting Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast in 2016. So kind of caught the podcast wave like pretty not early on, but like in the meat of it. Like they got right into it. So it's a funny podcast. Could probably do another Bigmark's meta podcast on Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast. And Shane kept doing comedy, and I feel like it's interesting with comedians and podcasts, because I feel like it's a way for them to kind of like keep their ideas sharp, and then like kind of keep their wits about them, and potentially try out bits. There's a lot of comedians, sadly, that they try out a bunch of bits, or they do a bunch of stuff on their podcasts that they tell all their stories, and then when they do it in their specials, or when they do it on their thing, everyone's already heard it, or at least I've heard it, and I feel like it's bummer. But again, I feel like comedians become podcasters, or comedians are drawn to podcasting because of that exactly. So anyway, in 2019, Shane was named Just for Laughs new face. So, he's being recognized by like big, like real legit comedic bodies, I guess. Obviously it's art and it's subjective. It's always weird when you're like getting recognized for that by organizations, right? Because it's kind of like, well, what the fuck? Like, who the fuck are you to be doling out these awards anyway? But I in some of my research, I came across this really interesting quote by an interviewer that was talking about Shane, and he said Shane gives off post-jock energy, and that really rung true, struck a chord with me, because I believe that I feel the same way as Shane. I feel the Shane way. But the interviewer went on to say, he it's the energy that of an athlete that had the wherewithal, or got injured or whatever, had the wherewithal about them to stop playing and realize that it wasn't for them, or they weren't cut out for it. And they hold no bones about it, and they're not bitter and all that stuff, right? Like, and I think I fall into that category. I love it. I love talking about sports. I love talking about my time in sports. I never regretted a minute of it. But I feel like I've kind of outgrown some of those kind of more jock tendencies. Maybe not for good, but depends on who you ask. But again, this is kind of Shane's whole MO, right? Like, he was that big jock. He was that, and the jock and the nerd, if you will, not to use a pejorative, but the jock and the smart kind of geeky, Poindexter type person, it's shifted, over the past few decades, right? You go back far enough, 70s, 80s, 90s, even in the early 2000s, sports were really important to people. I mean, America's different. I can't speak for America, but in Canada anyway, sports are really important to a lot of people, but not everybody. But when in the olden days, like I said, sports were really important to like young high school, university kids, like, young kids to high school to university, because that was like what you could do, right? And there wasn't a lot of other distractions. There wasn't video games that you could go home to, yeah, you could go and hang out with your friends and do fun stuff that way, but like you could only do so much. And like your parents were probably trying to kick you the fuck out of the house. Or it was kind of, you were like a little bit like, there was a little bit more like kind of social norms and a little bit more pressure from others to kind of conform to those social norms. And, I think a lot of people just, even if they didn't agree with everyone, they still went to these events. They still went to these things just for the experience, right? Because there was something to do. There's 4 channels on TV, shit like that, right? Like there was nothing to do at home. You had to go out anyway. So you may as well go to these events, AKA school dances, bullshit like that. And then school sporting events were huge. It was super important. At least in my parents' generation, for sure, of all the stories I used to hear, because my dad played high school sports and into college and university as well, but college sports as well, where you have a crowd and people know who you are when you're like walking around on campus. Like, yeah, don't get me wrong. I didn't play at the at Western. I was on the team, but like, and you're wearing a helmet anyway, so it's hard for people to recognize you all the time. You got to be kind of the star of the football team. But even then, there was like 40,000 fucking kids that went to Western, and like there was 100 of us on the football team, 110, whatever. They don't fucking know who you are. They don't know who, like, they don't give a fuck. And like the only time those kids came to our games, it was for like O week and stuff, when it was just like the first football game ever, and then they'd leave at halftime because we'd be kicking the shit out of everyone. At least when I played, we were always up. Shout out Western, go Stangs, go. Anyway, so times have changed is what I'm saying, because when I played, no one gave a fuck. So somewhere in the last like 20 years, people stopped giving a fuck about sports. And I think that all surrounded a little bit anyway. Don't get me wrong with all this distraction shit that I mentioned, which I have my beefs about. But it's this whole new mentality about like the masculine, toxic masculine approach, jocular, meat-headed, superficial, dumb, only caring about, like I said, superficial caring about looks and caring about getting the girl and fuck the nerds and putting them in a toilet and beating them up and hierarchies like that. Things really switched where that was like, people hate all that shit, and nerds and smart people are being, bolstered and raised up in society, which again, it kind of makes sense. Don't get me wrong. We want smart people out there, and we shouldn't be putting no one should be stuffed in lockers and things like that. But it's created an odd tension. I will admit it's created an odd tension, at least in my mind, because I was built to play sports. If I was born in any other era, I was probably built to be like a fucking gladiator or like some type of warrior or some type of like workhorse on a farm, beat me to death. And I could have died early. Who knows when I could have died, but I would have done what I was meant to do. And I would have done that. And there's something odd when you're like, oh, you're meant to do this sport, but you shouldn't fucking be like angry and aggressive and all this stuff. And I had all these coaches telling me, be angry, be aggressive, get after it. And then in life, it's like, don't be so angry, don't be so aggressive. Like, be gentle, because you're so big, you're gonna like hurt people and things like this. So like, I've always had like really conflicting things. And in sport, a lot of my attributes are celebrated, which was fun. It was nice. It was nice to be recognized for that. But outside of life, they're recognized, but they're not necessarily celebrated at all times. Overall, yes, there's some weird subconscious things that happen. Don't get me wrong, but it's always an odd thing to reconcile, being a former athlete and, just that whole like, oh, athletes are dumb and, they wasted their time playing sports now. Like, don't get me wrong, there's still the value of sport and team playing and stuff, but like, not ever, like some of the people that didn't play sports thought it was a fucking pure waste of time, to the point that they didn't even want to come and watch any of the sports or anything. Anyway, I've completely gone off the fucking rails here. But Shane Gillis, I think that's kind of why I relate to him a little bit, because he kind of gives off that energy, and he's a really smart guy, and can talk the talk, and I think he lives it a little bit more than I do. I think he was a little bit more of a Grove boy than I was. You know, a little bit more of like a jock, full on, like, you know, down with the sickness type dude. Anyway, like I mentioned, on paper, Shane Gillis is the man. Played D1 football, was in the Army, was on the cast of SNL in 2019. He was hired by SNL, by Lorne Michaels, as a cast member. He was on. He did the whole process. He went in and auditioned. They loved him. 5 days later, he was fired for comments from one of his podcast episodes in 2018. So Shane Gillis is an interesting character here, because this is where the meat and potatoes comes out. If you don't know about Shane, he was canceled essentially, and he was canceled really before he ever even really started. And I think Shane Gillis, or I don't think, I know, sadly, his kind of sometimes his story has been co-opted by like the right, or like kind of more like, you know, MAGA type people in the States anyway, to be like, oh, you know, this kid's got some good points, like he shouldn't have been canceled. But I think in some ways Shane Gillis's cancellation kind of highlighted cancel culture to the point of like, this kid didn't even get off the ground, man. Like he barely, you know, he's like barely in his 30s. He said something on a podcast that was taken completely out of context a year before. And again, it's not really fair before anything even started. And I think he was one of the first pebbles in the to fall before the landslide, you know, kind of cascade effect, because I feel like we're kind of getting out of this whole pure reactionary cancel culture. Like, in no way am I saying that no one's getting canceled anymore, because there are still people that are pieces of shit, and they should, you know, they should be kind of like not celebrated anymore. I think canceling people in the sense of totally forgetting about them, expunging them from the record, is very wrong. That should not happen, because we can't erase history, because then we're just bound to repeat it. But again, highlighting the fact that some people have done wrong and that we shouldn't celebrate them anymore is kind of more of the approach. But the reactionary cancel culture is kind of what I'm talking about. That like, soon as something happened, boom, we're fucking canceling this person. One little inkling of a rumor comes out before anything's even proven, their shit's done. They're losing deals. They're losing sponsorships. They're getting fired from shows. They're getting fired from their jobs. That's wrong. That shouldn't happen. So anyway, I think Shane kind of got caught up in all this stuff. And again, to be fully transparent, he dropped slurs about Asian and Chinese people. Said the C word. Said some other bad stuff. And again, this is like in a podcast, like I said, with two guys fucking riffing off each other, saying crazy shit. Who knows how many bong tokes they've hit before. Again, like, who cares, man? Like, sometimes comedy treads down dangerous pathways, and it's funny because sometimes it's funny because it's wrong. And because the person saying it shouldn't necessarily cancel them. It shouldn't, again, things shouldn't be necessarily celebrated, but sometimes shit's funny. And again, sometimes shit comes from that ether. It's that same area of creativity that fucking songs come from, and shit just like channels through you, and you know what I'm saying? Like, you're not really saying it at that point. And like, if we all share this consciousness, and if we're all subscribers to the Bigmark podcast, friends, the Bigmark podcast. Anyway, if we're all thinking on the same wavelength, and many times, and all the times I've mentioned in the past, if we are truly this collective unconsciousness, and we are all somehow connected that way, we're all saying this. So you fucking canceling some other person, you're just canceling yourself, bro. Look in the mirror, man. Start with the man in the mirror, or the woman in the mirror, or the person in the mirror. Shane did respond to all this. He tweeted, if you go through my 10 years of comedy, most of it is bad. Or sorry, if you go through my 10 years of comedy, most of it bad, you're going to find a lot of bad misses. I'm happy to apologize to anyone I have offended. So again, you know, he was happy to apologize to anyone who he offended. He addressed it. But again, this whole cancel culture thing, I think Shane approached it in an interesting way. He kind of just kept going. He started releasing specials. He made appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience in these group guest podcasts. I don't know, where Joe has like a bunch of his buddies on, like Ari Shaffir and Mark Norman and Shane Gillis came on, and they have this, it's like Protect the Parks or something like that. I think they gave it like a really stupid name like that so that so other people would hear it. I don't fucking know, but it's funny. And again, that kind of just like exposed him to more people. People heard the stories, people heard what happened, started looking in. Again, this is what happens with cancel culture. It just brings more people to check you out. Even if you're like, fuck this guy, I want to check out what he has to say so I can say fuck you more precisely. You're still watching his shit. And then most people are then, turned on to his stuff as I was. So anyway, again, Shane Gillis, a person who deserves a second chance. So go check out his special, Beautiful Dogs, out now. It's on Netflix. Love listening to his stuff. Shane, you're the man. Yeah, maybe you said some fucked up shit. Haven't we all? Anyway, thank you all for listening. Go check out Shane Gillis' comedy. Go follow along if you're not already to the podcast on our Twitter and Facebook. Oh my God. Twitter and Instagram at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Reach out to us. Hit up our DMs. Patreon. Love y'all. You're the best. Peace.